There is safety in being invisible, comfort even, at least for a while. But at what cost do I hide? And at what cost am I seen? And most importantly, when is it finally safe to start being me? Present but barely visible is the starting point for this project and the name of the first piece in the series. This piece captures the struggle of being present without being particularly visible, and it invites the viewer, that would be you, to contemplate what it takes to feel safe enough to be seen, and to live authentically in the world at a time when it feels increasingly dangerous to show up as our whole selves. Welcome to the second season of Loom-In-ESSENCE, where we talk a little bit about art and a lot about life. I am your host and artist, Shine. So this season, I will be working on some new pieces with a very specific goal in mind. I'm still going to be creating experimental loom-based beadwork, but this time around, I will be conducting experiments with the intention of finding solutions to the limitations and challenges of my current techniques in order to support the construction of my first large-scale piece, which is very exciting. And I'll also be carrying on with the vlog series so that you can continue to follow along with my creative journey and I can share my artistic approach with you, as well as the inspiration and personal stories behind each work of art. And in case you didn't catch the first season of Loom-In-ESSENCE and you'd like to get caught up on it, here's the link to the first video in the series, and I will also put it in the description for you. All right, let's get into it. So first I'll cover the experiments and the outcomes and how I'll apply this going forward. Then I will cover the design elements and the symbolism behind them and how all of this connects to the theme of the piece. And at the very end, I will share the personal inspiration behind the work of art. So if you want the backstory, stick around. Let's dive into the creative journey for this piece. So in the past, what I had done when building my looms is I used these anchor beads, that's what I would call them, to attach the warp threads to the loom. And the warp threads are the threads that are already on the loom before I start to weave the beads on. Now this had worked pretty well on the small scale, but it wasn't a perfect system. It was pretty labor intensive and it tended to be difficult to adjust the tension of. So working on a large scale, this just wasn't going to be the best way to do it. And I needed to find a new way of doing things. So I decided to try and develop a new method for attaching warp threads. And I decided to experiment with hooks in order to do this. Now, I was going to need pretty small hooks because I work with pretty small beads. So I decided to try using sewing hooks. These hooks are used as closures on clothing, on bras. And I decided to go with the smallest size they come in because I figured that would be the best starting point for me. Now, I feel like this is such an ADHD moment. This is already pretty complicated, but of course, instead of just moving forward with it, I had to find a way to make it even more complicated and basically go off on this side quest. But I decided I just didn't like the aesthetic of the hooks. They come in different metallic colors because they're metal. And because I was using like natural colored wood that was not painted or stained, I wanted something that was going to blend in because I didn't really want the hooks to draw attention. I wanted them to blend into the background. So I decided I would spray paint them because I didn't think that was going to be that difficult. So I threw a bunch of them on a plate, a little paper plate, went outside, put on my PPE, very important step, and I tried to spray paint these hooks in this paper plate. But what I ended up doing is I painted them onto the plate. So this did not work at all. And so to make a complicated idea even more complicated, I have to build a contraption to hang these hooks off of to then paint them. And yes, I actually did do this. And yes, it took forever. And I don't really know if this is really what I want to be doing with my time when I'm building these pieces, spray painting hooks on these racks, custom built racks. But yeah, I basically had to build these I just used common household items. I used bamboo skewers and thread that I had. I had to take the time to load each of these hooks on individually, then take these frames outside and paint the hooks on both sides, let them dry, then bring them in, and then manually remove every single hook, and then repeat that process over and over and over again. But then I hit a roadblock. I ran out of paint. Now, I should have seen this coming, but I did not. And unfortunately, I was not able to find the same combo of the brand, color, and batch. And the new batch of the same color was not the same color. So I ended up getting a few different options from different brands that seemed like they would be similar, and I used all of the paints and ended up with a few different shades of hooks. And you know what? It worked well enough. It wasn't perfect, but it was fine, and I definitely learned my lesson for next time. So please, I hope you also learn from my mistakes, because you don't want to be creating something like incredible and beautiful and elaborate and then run out of paint and not be able to get more. Anyways, that aside, finally, once I had finished painting all my hooks, it was time to figure out what to do next. So I'd been playing around with this idea in my mind of crocheting these hooks together somehow. I don't even crochet. I don't know how I got this idea, but I just kept seeing it in my head. And I just kept mentally doing it over and over and over again, figuring out like how I could basically just weave, stitch, crochet these hooks together. And so I just started to experiment with it, and it worked. It worked right off the bat. It worked so well that I was like, this is too easy. We don't like that. Things need to be difficult. So I decided, well, hey, why don't I just try another way just in case to see how it goes? And so I tried another way of attaching the hooks, and it didn't work as well, but at least I had that information, right? I think that there's actually a lot of value in just messing around, trying different ways of doing things, just being a bit playful with the work that you're creating and seeing where that process takes you. And since my first try worked, I decided to go with that method, and I started attaching the hooks to themselves. So basically, I was almost creating a chain of hooks that I could then attach to the frame. Now, normally I work with different shaped frames using branches that have different angles and curvatures, but I wanted to eliminate all of those variables for my first try with this new method, just to keep things a little bit simple, believe it or not. So I decided to use a square frame for this, and I decided I would attach these chains of hooks onto a bamboo skewer, or onto two bamboo skewers that I could place at either side of the frame. And I also had an idea of how to do this already. Maybe it's because I've used a sewing machine since I was fairly young. And so just seeing how the sewing machine works and how the needle goes in and like the pattern of the threads, I just had an idea of how I would maneuver this crochet needle to be able to attach these hooks. And I started doing it, and it worked. I wasn't very fast in the beginning, but my technique was working, and I just kept doing it and got a little bit faster as I went, and it was holding up. So for something that felt like very roundabout, things were actually coming together relatively well, and I started to build the frame. Moving along, let's talk about spacing. So in this case, the size of the hooks woven together, coupled with the angles of the frame, determined the distance between the warp threads. And this is different from what I've done in the past, because with my other method, I can manipulate the distance between the warp threads to fit with whatever size beads I want to work with. But with this method, I didn't have that type of flexibility. So I had to experiment with different beads to see what would fit best. And in the end, I ended up going with 11O beads by two different brands because there's a slight difference in the dimensions depending on the brand, and this just happened to be what fit best into the set space that I had. So now that I'd figured out the spacing for the piece, it was time to do a couple more experiments. I figured since this was my first time using this new technique for attaching warp threads, it just made sense to explore some of the other things I want to throughout this project to see how it affects those elements and if there are any unforeseen hiccups along the way or things that I'm going to need to work out for the next piece. So the first thing I wanted to do was work with positive and negative space and leaving parts of the loom unbeaded upon. So this was pretty easy to work into the design. Basically, I just used the letters as the beaded portion, and the rest of the design is unbeaded upon. And the second thing that I wanted to try was working in sections or segments. I built this into the design essentially by using these letters that are completely disconnected from one another. So I would have to work on one letter at a time and see how that affected the overall piece, see how that affected the tension of the warp threads, and if they needed to be readjusted more often than usual or not. I think it's also worth mentioning that because this was my first time using 2 beads between the warp threads instead of 1, I had to figure out how to make that work with my design, since I was doing these irregular shaped letters as opposed to a design that was just square or rectangular and had the same number of beads in each row. So it was a little bit tricky and it took some practice, and I even needed to redo parts of it, but in the end I think it ended up looking okay. And here's a close-up for you where you can see the details of how the letters ended up looking. Let's talk about outcomes and what this means for future pieces. So first of all, hooks. The hooks worked. This method worked really well, and I'm excited to work with it again. I think what I'll do the next time is I will work with an irregular shaped frame where the sides are not perfectly parallel, and I'll see how this impacts the overall piece. Next up is spacing. I have to be honest, I did not love using 2 slightly different sized beads. It just didn't make my brain happy. So I think in future, either I would find a way to work with 2 of the same sized beads, or I would find a way to work with just 1 bead between each of the warp threads. And I would do this by working with a more angled frame that makes the distance between the warp threads a little bit smaller. The last thing is working in sections and leaving parts unbeaded upon. This also worked really well, and because I had attached the warp threads with the hooks, when it came time to adjust the tension, it was so much easier and so much faster. So that part was definitely a win. Next, let's talk about the design elements of the piece and how this relates to the theme, which explores the difference between being visible versus being seen, and the masking and unmasking of identity and sharing different parts of ourselves. So first is the color palette. You will notice that I've used very neutral, natural tones. This is intentional. I wanted it to have a raw, kind of unprocessed look to it. I wanted it to look like the piece wasn't dressed up. Next is the letters. You'll notice they're clear and staggered, and there's a lot of empty space. So I was going for subtlety here. I wanted the design to be visible, but also hard to read, so that it didn't really stand out and it took effort to be seen. And in fact, it's even easy to miss and can blend into the background. The staggering of the letters is actually very intentional as well. Like there's this playfulness to it. The letters are jumbled and it's almost mysterious, like a riddle or a code to be cracked. And this serves as another way to further mask the message, which you may have figured out. And this represented a desire to be visible while also simultaneously being unsure. So it's almost like there's this experimental quality of being a little bit visible, testing the waters, seeing if it's safe. Lastly, there are the unfinished ends, which are significant in a couple of ways. First of all, the loose ends represent potential for more to be added. It's like I said earlier, where there's this testing of the waters, like, is it safe to be more visible? If it is, more can be added, more can be shared. If it's not, we'll just fade into the background. The second thing is these loose ends are intentionally a little bit messy, and there's no attempt to hide or disguise them or tuck them away neatly to make the piece more presentable. There's something candid and intimate about it, and I really feel like this sets the tone for the piece. It's an invitation to establish a more relaxed, more open rapport with the viewer, one where there isn't a pretense of perfection, but rather an acceptance driven by a need for authenticity, which is central to this piece. And this is something I've been thinking about a lot recently. Essentially, how to be more me, how to be more visible and more present in more areas of my life. And of all places, I feel like I found the key to this on the other side of the planet. So imagine this. It's 2023. It's my first time since COVID traveling. And here I am in Melbourne, Australia, which is one of my favorite places. And as the story progresses, you'll see why. So the sun is shining, the breeze is breezy, the weather is warm. I'm with my friends and I'm making new ones. Life is good and I'm feeling lucky. And at the time, I didn't know exactly what it was, but I could feel the difference. I felt alive and well and vibrant, and like for the first time in a long time, I was thriving. But then I came back to Canada. Now, not to knock Canada, but it was winter, and if you're familiar with this part of the world, then you know where this story is going. Needless to say, the sun was not shining. It was cold, it was dark. And at the time, I didn't know exactly what it was, but I could feel the difference. I tried to hold on to that me that I had been, but somehow I just couldn't seem to find that version of myself. And I would love to tell you that suddenly I had an epiphany and everything became clear and came together, but that's just not what happened. Sometimes clarity is not something that happens in an instant. It's something that's gathered over the course of multiple experiences. And lucky for me, it took many trips to many places, including multiple returns to Melbourne, for me to realize that something magical was happening while I was here. So I started off by looking for a common denominator. And I thought maybe at first that it was just a matter of me traveling. So I went to London, I went to Berlin, and I found the answer was no. It wasn't just traveling. And honestly, it just made me miss Melbourne even more. And that should have been a hint, but I didn't catch on yet. And then I thought maybe it was just the sunny environment. So I decided to go to Southeast Asia for the winter. And though it did help my mental health in terms of being in a warm climate and having a lot of sunshine and getting to be outdoors a lot, that wasn't all of it either. So I went back to Melbourne to look for clues. Well, not really. I went back to Melbourne to see one of my partners and to see some friends. But once I started reconnecting with people, I started to connect the dots. And this is what I realized. While I had been living in Melbourne, the people I lived with, the people I worked with, the people I became friends with were people who were kind of like me. People who were quirky and queer and polyamorous, gender non-conforming, neurodivergent, inclined to travel and live in these creative and unusual ways. And I found myself feeling safe and accepted and free to be me. And the more me I was, the more joy I felt. Like, just genuinely joyful to be me and to spend time being me. And although I did have this type of community in Toronto, I find I also spend a significant amount of time in spaces where I just don't feel as safe and as comfortable being all of these parts of me at the same time. In fact, I often feel pressure to hide or to shrink parts of myself to make others more comfortable or to make things easier for myself. But I guess I just hadn't realized the toll that only showing up as parts of me was taking on me until I realized how much of me was actually missing. I feel like, you know, I guess because I've spent so much time living here, I just got used to hanging out with a friend who knows I'm queer, who knows I'm polyamorous, but like maybe doesn't know that I'm non-binary or that I use gender-neutral pronouns. And I would just let that slide. I wouldn't bring it up. Or I would spend time in a space where people know I'm Muslim because everybody around me is Muslim. But I would kind of hide the fact that I was queer or non-binary or polyamorous or any of these things that just make me so different from the people I was around. And I think part of that comes from growing up not really seeing any kind of representation of people like me. So I just learned to show the parts of myself that felt safe and comfortable in each of the spaces that I was spending time in my life. And I like developed that pattern as I got older. And it was only when I finally went to a new place where I felt really safe and accepted that I started being all of these parts of me at the same time. And it's made me consider how we show up in different ways, in different situations, in different social circumstances, and how in every new encounter, we get to choose how much we reveal about ourselves, and the impact that feeling safe and comfortable and accepted has on how we navigate these situations. So let me know if you can relate. I would love to hear your personal stories and hear about what makes you feel safe, of experiences you've had where you felt like you could show up as your full, authentic self, and what your ideas are and insights on how we can foster a greater sense of safety and acceptance in our communities. So drop me a comment if you feel comfortable doing that. I would love to hear your thoughts. And if I get a lot of comments, I would love to make a follow-up video so that we can keep this conversation going. All right, that is it for this video. And last but not least, I would like to acknowledge the support of the Canada Council for the Arts for making this project possible. And I would like to thank the viewers for watching. So thank you very much. And remember to like, share, and subscribe so that you don't miss the next installment. And I will see you next time. All right, bye.